Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Babylon 5 versus Deep Space Nine, the podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at B5VSDS9. We're available on all major and most minor podcatchers. Please like and subscribe on your podcatcher of choice. If you have a question about either show or anything else you'd like us to tackle, leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcatcher. Take a screenshot and email the screenshot and your question to us at b5bsds9@gmail.com, and we will answer your question live on the show. We plan to start a Patreon with bonus content in the near future, so if you have any ideas of stuff you'd like to see for bonus episodes, please hit us up again at email at b5bsds9@gmail.com. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Babylon 5 versus Deep Space Nine. I'm Bob from Cascadia. I got Matt from the Southland on the line. How you doing today, Matt?
Doing pretty well, feeling much better.
Great. Glad you've recovered after your intensive juicing regimen. It's good to have you back with us. So today we're covering season 1, episode 5 of Babylon 5, Parliament of Dreams, which aired on the 23rd of February, 1994, and we're covering the DS9 episode 13 of season 1, Battle Lines, which aired on the 25th of April, 1993. Matt, do you want to kick us off with a quick summary of Parliament of Dreams?
No problem, yeah. It starts off with an old political nemesis of Ambassador Jakar. Sends this deathbed message to Jakar saying that he's hired an assassin that's going to kill Jakar within the next 2 days. So the whole episode basically has Jakar freaking out, watching his back, trying to make sure that any encounter he has is not his last.
Yeah, and then in the B plot, we've got Commander Sinclair's old flame, Catherine Sakai, who happens to pass through Babylon 5, and she's a replacement character for Sinclair's girlfriend in the TV movie, The Gathering, whose name I've honestly already forgotten.
It was Carolyn, Bobby. Carolyn, come on.
Yeah, awful. I
was very glad that they actually did tie that up though, because when I was watching it, that was what I made in my notes. I said, "Wait a minute, I thought he already had a girlfriend." I'm like, okay, then they tied that up in the episode. So
yeah, and I guess it's worth stressing, just so we don't think that Commander Sinclair is a very prolific lover or anything, that the TV movie and season 1 are about a year apart. I think they refer to this a few times in season 1, but it's like most people have been on the Babylon 5 station for at least a year early in season 1. So that's kind of worth stressing.
So what you're saying is that Babylon 5 is a port of call, not a port for Sinclair.
Oh, just you wait. The romance plots get really bad in season 3. Really bad. But did you want to talk us through our last subplot there?
Yeah, one of the other things going on in the station this particular episode, we have this week-long festival of religions. All the different species have religions, and they're sharing what makes them unique. And Sinclair the entire time is trying to figure out what he can do to represent Earth's dominant religion. Which, I mean, if you live on Earth, there's not really a dominant religion per se, but
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting conceit, because all the other alien ambassadors, Jakar and Londo and Delenn, have supervised like these specific rituals, whereas Sinclair opts to just totally avoid having a ritual, and he just lines up, more than 17 priests and pastors or just adherents of different faiths from Earth, and just lines them up murderers row style, and then takes the ambassadors down and introduces each of them. So it's kind of like a nice little 90s multiculturalism moment. It's very inclusive, a lot of indigenous religions, a lot of variants of Christianity. There's even an atheist. There's also a little funny minor joke in the beginning of the episode with Catherine arrives on the station on a transport named the Spinoza. And Spinoza was a famous Dutch Jewish philosopher who had a kind of pantheistic metaphysics and ethics, which, kind of meaning God is nature, God is all sort of metaphysics. Although some people, both supporters and people who wanted to label him a heretic, read that as a crypto-atheistic metaphysics. He was denying a necessity or a need for God outside of nature. But anyway, that opening up with a ship named after Spinoza is kind of a funny little joke. So the trick Sinclair comes up with is a nice bit of 90s multiculturalism, and introduces us to all of these different religious practices on Earth. But it does kind of run up into this old problem of science fiction where where humans get to be diverse. We have many languages, many cultures, many different religious practices, whereas alien species in science fiction tend to be imagined as monolithic. They tend to be imagined as, having a fairly narrow range of personality traits. They also tend to be imagined as not having like cultural variations in the same way that we know humans of Earth have today. So in that way, it's kind of playing into a weird trope of science fiction. Given that Star Trek is maybe even more notorious than Babylon 5 for having this sort of monolithic portrayals of aliens, of like, Vulcans are logical, Klingons are bloodthirsty and honorable, Romulans are devious. I was sort of curious, Matt, like what were you thinking just, so far? We're about 5 episodes into this project, of how the alien portrayals of Babylon 5 and DS9 are coming off to you.
What I'm seeing with the different species and races on Babylon 5, it is following suit to what we see in Star Trek. You're seeing this clear cut, almost cookie cutter definition of what a Klingon is, a cookie cutter definition of what a Minbari is. They're not unique in a sense as from character to character. I mean, you see all the Klingons you see on DS9 are the same. All the Ferengi you see on DS9 are the same. Most of the Bajorans are all freedom fighters. It seems like you don't see a lot of other representation there. Are you seeing that as well?
Yeah. I mean, I think with the Ferengi, we'll get a little bit more sort of variation in personality and values as DS9 goes on. But yeah, certainly right now, like, Rom, Quark, Nog, the Nagus, all have, a pretty identical value set. And even though there's really fun like personality variation among them, they're
Right.
they're pretty set in their ways. Although when we introduce some other Ferengis later, and when Rom gets more developed.
Right. Rom breaks the mold kind of with for the Ferengi, in my opinion, later on in the season.
I mean, here it's kind of interesting how slowly they're developing Rom too. Like I think I wasn't taking careful note of this, but I think in the first couple episodes he doesn't even have a name, and then I think they give him a name in the Nagus episode, but he's still just very very scheming and just like a less efficient Quark. There's no sense that there's another side of Rom, or he has other interests. You just get the feeling that he's just not as good at Quark as being a cutthroat businessman.
Well, speaking of cutthroat, like Jakar and Natoth is this the newest aide that he gets this time around, correct? Is that her name?
Yeah, Natah.
As far as the Narn go, they seem to be cut from the same cloth as well. They're all kind of, backstabbing, wanting to, or constantly kind of at each other's throats. Did you get that from the Narn at all? Like, do you see that? Another common trope with them?
It does seem to be, although the Narn do get a lot more developed, because they are kind of cartoonishly villainous early in
Yes.
Babylon 5 season 1. Although it's worth noting that even though they all have these broad similarities, like Nataf seems to be a pretty different personality than Kodoth, who was Jakar's original aide. And apparently they wrote Kodoth out because the actress hated the makeup. And so there's a casual line in this episode that she gets taken out by one of your airlocks. So you're proven right yet again.
Yeah,
Congratulate yourself.
everyone gets sucked out of airlocks apparently on these stations. Uh,
But yeah, it's interesting to imagine. It was this episode originally written for Kodoth's character, and was this supposed to be like Kodoth and Jakar's like reconciliation episode? Because they got off to a kind of rocky start in the earlier Kodoth episode, or it could just be that they decided to go in a just different direction because although there's upfront tension between Natoth and Jakar because Jakar is paranoid because of this assassination plot and he suspects Natoth. Like they actually turn out to work very well together and they have this chemistry that I really admired. And there's a kind of a shared deviousness to them. But I don't know, they also like kind of use each other's foils really well. It kind of reminds me of like the dynamic of like a screwball comedy. So in that way, at least, I was satisfied. It didn't feel like Jakar and Natoth were exactly the same. It felt like they had a kind of real relationship with two individuals.
yeah, I like I like Natoth's character better so far. I wasn't too impressed with the original character. What was her name again?
Kodoth.
Kodoth. Yeah, I didn't even really remember the character because it just didn't stick well. All she did
Yeah,
was show her teeth like twice, I think, and that was about it. But you're
I
right.
think
Maybe that character was to develop into something different. I mean, they didn't give it time, and she didn't want to do it. So, but
yeah,
I was
right.
impressed with it. I was impressed with the Toth. I thought she was a much more interesting character.
I will say from what I've seen, they don't Natoth so far, and granted, yeah, there's a lot I haven't seen, but from what I've seen so far, Natoth doesn't really live up to her promise as a character. They do a lot of development for the other two aides to they for Veer, who's the aide to Londo, the Centauri ambassador, and for Lanier, who's the aide to Delenn, the Minbari ambassador. Londo and Lanier get a lot of character development, and that doesn't really seem to be the case for Natoth from what I've seen, which is kind of a missed opportunity of the show. I'll also give you a little teaser that eventually there will be an aid to the Vorlon eventually, and that's an interesting thing when that happens.
Okay. Well, with Lanier, this is his first appearance on the station. He shows up. He's played by Bill Mimi. Is that how you say his name? Bill Mimi.
I've always thought of it as Mummy, but I don't really know
Mummy.
now that you mention it.
It's
Yeah,
missing an
that's
M.
it's the dilemma of podcasting. You write all this stuff down and then you have no idea how to actually say it.
Yeah, when I Google his name, it said, "Did you mean Bill Murray?" And I was like, "No, I did not mean Bill Murray. Bill Mimi." But anyway, if you remember him, he was the evil kid on on the Twilight Zone. He was also Will Robinson on Lost in Space.
It's kind of interesting in the new Lost in Space. Have you seen it?
You talking about the movie or the one on Netflix?
The one on Netflix. The movie we just don't speak of.
Yeah, the movie was in the late '90s with Matt LeBlanc.
There was also a Lost in Space pilot, maybe like 4 or 5 years after the movie. I think like Sci-Fi or UPN or the CW, one of those networks commissioned it. And I think John Woo, the famous Hong Kong action director, actually directed it. I might be wrong about that, but I think he directed it. But apparently it was very bad and didn't go into production. But they sold all of the sets and props to the reboot of Battlestar Galactica in around, I think that came out around 2004 2005. So all the props and set designs for the aborted Lost in Space pilot went to the reboot of Battlestar Galactica, which is just a kind of odd thing.
That's
Um,
interesting.
but the new Lost in Space on Netflix. Have you seen that? I know we both seen
I
that.
haven't seen it yet, no, but it's something I'll probably delve into after watching all this '90s TV.
Yeah, I really like it. My uncle's a huge old Lost in Space fan, and we watched some of the new Lost in Space together. It was fun. So the famous villain from the original Lost in Space is Dr. Smith, right?
Right.
Who's played by this really, I forget the actor's name, but a really great kind of camp British actor plays him, very kind of subtextually homosexual. I don't even know if it's subtextually. It's a great performance. So what they do in the new Lost in Space is they gender swap Dr. Smith, and so they have Parker Posey from all those 90s independent rom-coms play Dr. Smith, and she does a really great job. But she's sort of a con woman and has assumed the Dr. Smith identity. She's not actually a doctor. That's not actually her name. And she assumed it from a guy on a ship. And the guy on the ship she steals his identity from is played by Bill Mummy.
Strangely enough, too, and I've mentioned this, I don't remember if I mentioned this on the podcast, but he was the co-creator and writer of Space Cases on Nickelodeon, the show that would eventually evolve into the new Star Trek Prodigy series that's coming out soon, but way back in 1996.
Well, I don't know if we know if it evolved. It just looks remarkably similar. But I mean, so it's sort of the modern day equivalent of the did DS9 rip off Babylon 5 controversy. I guess it's the did Star Trek Prodigy rip off Space Cases, and he created that with Peter David, right?
Correct. Yes, he did.
Yeah. So Peter David's kind of interesting. He's a comics writer, and he does a lot of tie-in novels for Star Trek, for Babylon 5, I think for a couple other 90s sci-fi properties. I think David might have even written an episode or two of Babylon 5, the TV show, which is that until recently that wasn't things that tie-in novelists usually did. They usually just got stuck with tie-in novels. So okay, interesting. So, what do you have any thoughts on Lanier as a whole? We kind of talked about his the actor and the sort of broader TV sci-fi connections, but any thoughts on the character of Lanier so far?
Well, when he shows up, he wants to. He says certain things to Delenn that they talk about, like the Gray Council and things that we haven't really been. We've kind of hinted at before, but really haven't been exposed to. And Delenn's basically tells him, shut up, you won't call me that. You won't call me by my, it's an official title. Hold on, I wrote it down.
Satai.
Satai, yes. You won't refer to me as that, and you will not mention the Grey Council again. You'll just call me by my Delenn. He seems a little put off by this at first, but then he realizes, like, this is his job, so he just kind of falls in line. But it just adds more to that mystery of what's going on with Delenn. What does she really represent, which we mentioned in previous episodes.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. He's sort of set up as this kind of like overeducated novice, almost seems to kind of be
right.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think that's how they set Veer up too. But with Veer, they at least right now they're tending to play him only for comedy, whereas Lanier, is allowed to look a little bit ridiculous, but he's not quite like the butt of the show's humor in the way that Veer, Wando's Centauri aide, is.
A couple of things that I pointed out in the episode just as I was going through that I just wanted to bring up real quick.
Yeah.
Jakar eating a dog's head. Did you notice that?
I only noticed it after you mentioned it.
And he's eating a dog head and singing. He sings some like really weird chant or something. I don't know what it was, but that was kind of a WTF moment in that episode.
Oh, wasn't it some sort of old Earth song? Like
it was like a shanty or something. I don't know what it is.
Yeah. Oh, a sea shanty. Yeah. Apparently all the Zoomers love sea shanties now.
Another thing, Zorak returns again. This is I guess his third appearance at this point.
Something like that.
Yeah, and he provides a bodyguard car. So Zorak is just headed this underground black market. As you've been watching more, does he continue to show up?
He's not done. I think he has a couple more season 1 appearances, but I don't believe he appears after season 1, is my understanding.
I wonder if you ever see his full body, because I feel like you just see his upper torso part, like his upper like claws and things.
I don't think you ever see any more than what you're seeing now, but I could be wrong.
Like I would die laughing if like you saw it was just like a human bottom like part and then like
yeah, just some guy walking around to the craft service table with that on top and just normal human torso and legs. Two other quick points I wanted to make was it's sort of interesting. Jakar doesn't really go to the station personnel for help dealing with this assassination plot because he has a shady political past and he's afraid that it would threaten his standing among the other ambassadors. And so it's kind of an interesting echo of how he blackmails Londo in the TV movie, because Londo's grandfather apparently was a war criminal during the occupation of Narn, and Jakar has the goods on Londo's granddad. And then the last point I wanted to make about this episode was, and this maybe it kind of ties back to our discussion about the diversity of human cultures versus the monolithic nature of alien cultures in TV SF. But we do find out that the Centauri used to have a sibling species on their world, the Zon, but they genocided them all. And so it's told as a joke, and it is pretty funny, but it's also kind of a grim insight into the Centauri character. And maybe it sort of gives an explanation for the monolithic nature of the Centauri, that they have this kind of aggressive and violent past that created this monoculture.
It was funny to you, but I had no idea how to take that when I heard it. I was like, what? Especially the way it was presented with at the celebration. You've got Ivanova drunk there. You've got everybody else just like having a good time, and Sinclair, of course, has a stick up his butt, but he's so focused on his old flame showing it back up on the station.
Yeah, very distracted, very distracted. I mean, I think the performance that Veer and Londo do to delivering the fact that they exterminated the Zon is funny, and I think the reactions like from from the humans and from the Minbari are funny. I grant you that the actual fact of the extermination is not funny, but like I think the performance and the way it's received is darkly funny.
It says something about Londo's character though, right there. It kind of stuck with me.
Yeah, well, and even Veer, who's usually portrayed as like a very like good-natured guy, kind of just goes along with it and doesn't seem to think anything is very weird about it. All right, so we'll pivot to Battle Lines, episode 13 of DS9 season 1. So in the A plot, which is really the only plot, although I guess you have O'Brien and Dax trying to rescue these people, but the A plot is Cisco, Maytira, Dr. Bashir, and Kai Opaka, who's the Bajoran religious leader, the Bajoran Pope that we met in the pilot. They're in a runabout. They're taking the Kai for her first excursion through the wormhole into the Gamma Quadrant, and they get stranded on a Gamma Quadrant moon amidst two warring factions of exiles who have been confined to this planet. And that's pretty much Battle Lines. What'd you think, Matt?
Yeah, Kai Opaka showing back up. I was like, okay, this is going to be a Bajoran religion prophet-centered episode of some sort, but it really wasn't. With the Kai reminds me of like the Russian babushkas when she shows up.
She does have like big Russian grandmother energy, or do you mean like there's nesting dolls?
Yeah. Yes. She gets big Russian grandmother energy. I mean, she just has this automatic, like she's drawn to the wormhole. She wants to know more about it, and like when she first shows up on the station, of course, they tell her that there's no ships that are supposed to come through. So Benjamin Sisko's like, all right, I guess we can go and give you a ride. He's just like smirking out the side of his mouth because he wants to please this Bajoran leader. And then, they go in the wormhole. They wind up in the Gamma Quadrant. They crash onto this planet. And the people there, I felt like they were kind of like rejects from some other show. Like, I don't know where they got the costumes from or whatever, but they just seemed like they were from something else. Like, I don't know, like Hercules or something was filming at that time. They just like grabbed the outfits. They were like Mad Max looking, I guess. Like, I don't know. I don't know how to explain their look. But then the actor that plays their leader gave me really big Sylvester Stallone, Mickey Rourke vibes.
You mean Jonathan Banks?
Yes, Jonathan Banks. Okay, yeah, you knew who he was. I didn't.
Yeah, that's Mike from Breaking Bad.
Okay, there we go. I did not know that, and I should have looked that up. Now that makes sense because you were like telling me about the guy, and I was like, to me, he looked like Mickey Rourke or Sylvester Stallone.
Interesting. Yeah,
that makes sense now. Okay.
Yeah, granted, this is like a dozen years or so before Breaking Bad, but yeah, maybe like more like 14 or 15 years before Breaking Bad. But Yeah. No, it's interesting because he you mostly think of him for crime shows. Like the two shows I associate with him, or there was this late '80s crime show called Wise Guy, where
Mhm.
he was like the sort of Commissioner Gordon figure, or like the sort of liaison figure for this FBI agent. Although I think they call him something, they don't call it the FBI. He's an FBI agent who goes undercover, and Jonathan Banks plays his handler, and he's this real kind of like ball busting, kind of laconic, cold guy. And then you see a lot of that in his portrayal as Mike on Breaking Bad, who's and later Better Call Saul, where he's this kind of facilitator for different criminal organizations. But yeah, as much as I love Jonathan Banks, you can't really say that his sort of energy jives with TV science fiction. I just don't
This
think it's
was
a
not
natural
his
fit.
finest role. This was
No,
totally not
no.
his finest role. It was not yeah, I mean, so bad that I didn't even catch on that was him. Wow. It's funny because I'll recognize the most random characters like out of nowhere, and you can just pull out anybody. I just like, okay, that was like we've been watching a couple episodes ahead, and like well, you end up seeing like the judge from Ghostbusters plays a Cardassian later on. And for some reason, I know this, but I didn't recognize Mike from Breaking Bad as one of the as the
I mean, he is under
leader.
a lot of makeup, to be fair.
Yeah, yeah, you're just making
Yeah.
excuses for me now.
Yeah. Well, like I said, it's not a good performance, but it's also it's just not a well written character, and ultimately, I just don't think like the sort of energy that Jonathan Banks has is very
I don't think
compatible with early
I
early
don't think the overall plot of this episode was very well written, honestly. Like I didn't care for it much. Just the
Yeah.
idea that the planet can resurrect, like you just these people are constantly at war with each other, and then they are resurrected after fighting, after they die. So they're just constantly in battle, and they won't come together and try to work out peace. And then Bashir tries to figure out what's going on, and it takes him like 30 minutes to figure out what they've probably been trying to figure out for like decades. That if they leave the planet, they're going to die. They can't survive unless they stay on the planet. Of course, Bashir figures this out like at the most like opportune moment. Did you catch on to that? That was like
No,
super
I didn't.
science fiction trope. He basically
Yeah.
jumps into the middle of the fight. He's like, "Don't let them kill you, because if you do die, you can't come out. You can't leave the planet." Like I think Cisco's like mid punch or something like that, and or, no, I'm sorry, like Cisco's about to be shot, and I guess Cisco at this point was just like, okay, well they're all coming back, I'll just come back too, and then Bashir's like, no, don't do that, and he
I
died.
mean, honestly, the only reason we covered this is just because it writes Kai Opaka off the show, which is, a sort of like plot significant thing. And I don't know, it's a weird choice because she's set up in the emissary as such a big deal, and you get the impression from emissary that she's going to be in future episodes, and then they just decided to write her off in her second appearance. Did you have any thoughts about that?
Did they really write her off though? Because she stays on the planet, so I mean, there's still that possibility. It's like they left it to where if they wanted to, they could find some way. Like maybe they found some magical cure at some point to fix these microbes that are causing problems.
Yeah, I
I,
guess they write her off in a way that they can always come
it's,
back to. It's not like Kodoth who just gets airlocked and who's gone. So they could have
mm,
always come back, but they never do. Apparently in the reboot DS9 novels, or not reboot, in the relaunch DS9 novels, Jake does go back to this planet. And I don't know if he frees her or not, but I don't know. I honestly can't say that I'm dying to read that novel.
that does not sound interesting at all.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't really have very much else to say about this. I mean, one thing, just to as kind of we're keeping an eye on Cisco's character, it is pretty interesting that we see him get really heated in this episode, both with Kira, because Kira kind of really enthusiastically takes sides in this conflict, which is kind of a Starfleet no go for a couple of reasons. And then on the other hand, when Cisco is proposing his plan, Bashir questions if it affects the Prime Directive, and Cisco gets really heated and really defensive about no, the Prime Directive clearly doesn't apply here. And so I don't know. That's just sort of interesting. Is this more fiery portrayal of Cisco? I mean, granted, he's under a lot of stress, but I don't think
Yeah,
I don't think they would write like Picard being quite this volatile in similar situations.
no, Kira is definitely like the kind of person that I can't stand working with.
Why
So
is that?
it just she's just kind of like how quickly she took sides in the matter instead of being diplomatic. I guess there's no real like she wasn't diplomatic at all, and you see this more and more as the show goes on. She just kind of she's always picking a side like immediately. There's no middle ground. Maybe I think later on I think I'm more accepting of her, but in these first few episodes, I'm just like I cannot stand just how she acts. Uh,
I will
and
say though, I grant that she's kind of annoying in this episode, but I think the episode does, I will give it some credit. I think it does say something a little interesting about her character. Like there is a way that like she's confused and torn up about Kai Opaka's seeming death when the runabout crashed on this moon. And so her throwing herself into the conflict, I think the episode presents it as like, she needs to take sides in this war so she can have a sense of meaning. And, obviously that kind of rhymes with her past in the Bajoran underground. And so I can appreciate that. I grant that it's not a very attractive episode for her. But I would also say even I really liked how they wrote Kira in the third episode of DS9, Past Prologue, where she's really getting in Cisco's face, but she's not doing it for like stupid personal reasons exactly. Like she's doing it because she has a very clear idea of what politically needs to happen for Bajor, and she sees Cisco dragging his feet or obstructing that, and so she just goes at him. And I think that's actually a pretty interesting angle for the character, and in some ways I wish that had continued more, where like Cisco's interest as representing Starfleet are not going to be the same as Kira's interest representing Bajor. And I think a lot more useful friction could have come from that. Which, granted, I don't think the friction between Cisco getting irritated at her in this episode is that useful or interesting. But just in general, like I think that friction could have been profitable for the show if they kept at it.
you mentioned Cisco and Bashir in this episode. Bashir makes like this joke like about the people on the planet having finished up their prison sentences by this point. And Cisco goes off on Bashir after he says that. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
catch that.
I didn't catch that. That's funny though. That is
Yeah,
funny.
like Cisco doesn't like want that kind of sense of humor at this point when I guess when they're stranded on the planet and not really sure what's going down. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, yeah. No, I kind of like that though. I like that. I mean, because it's not really a very frivolous topic, right? Like these guys are condemned to this kind of awful living death. So yeah. Do you want to go ahead and move into like more comparative questions?
Sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I'll start with a minor one. This is just a notation of we've been tracking Godfather references. So, last week we had a Godfather reference when Quark is playing the Nagus and, kind of doling out favors, and people are coming to him for favors. And then this week we have a reference to that famous scene in The Godfather where the head of a studio wakes up with the beheaded head of his favorite horse in his bed because he won't let the Frank Sinatra stand-in out of a contract. And so the equivalent is Jakar wakes up with a death blossom in his bed. So it was kind of a nice little homage to that Godfather scene. And so that was the minor comparison I had. And then, did you have anything for Thirst Watch?
Oh yeah. And this is where we learn that Jakar apparently has a fascination with Earth women. Um, I mean, big time. He had like women's panties in his quarters.
Yeah, and I think we sort of got that impression too, because isn't it in the TV movie where he's propositioning Lyda Alexander, the first station telepath, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah,
And that
apparently it's common knowledge though because the aide knows, like the aide mentions it.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, and it'll keep coming up in small ways, but it's kind of funny. Like it's I don't know, it's almost played like it's kind of like a political liability for him, because he's like this sort of part of this defensive rising power. So I don't know, but it is a sort of interesting joke. Like it when he's propositioning Lida in the TV movie, it felt creepy. But the in this episode and in subsequent episodes, it feels a little more wholesome to me, if that distinction makes sense.
So another thing too that I noticed, looking at the different religious aspects of both, there was a scene in Parliament of Dream where Delenn is talking about she's going through the ceremony, okay?
Hmm.
And within the ceremony, there's all these weird things going on, and it almost looks like it's not easy to follow what they're doing. But at some point, they're all asked to eat fruit or some sort. It's like a cherry or something,
Hmm. Hmm.
and Delenn puts the cherry in her mouth, and you're just like, okay, that's whatever. But she's looking straight at Sinclair, and then she says, "So it begins." Does What's going on there? There's something.
I don't
Is
feel
it her?
like I can say what I know goes on there, but I will say that this ceremony comes up again. Weirdly, I just watched a season 3 episode last night where this ceremony sort of comes up again. So um it does there's a kind of continuing trope of like the Minbari trying to get the other people to engage with their ceremonies.
Okay,
And
because I was confused because those were her words. So it begins, and then later on, Catherine mentions that that was considered a wedding ceremony. They, like I said, they don't really make it clear, like when you're seeing the ceremony, what's going
yeah,
on.
although she does throw in the caveat, like I think it's something to the effect of depending on how seriously the people involved take it. I think it's her caveat.
Right. So I don't like. Does that mean did Sinclair get married to Delenn? I don't know. I'm trying to pick up because I know there's some weird stuff going on there. I just don't know what it is.
I don't
Um,
think that's immediately going to be followed up on, but it's clear it is setting up for plot in later seasons of the show.
but then later on, to kind of make the connection to the DS9 episode, you know, at one point, does Opaka refer to Cisco as the emissary within the episode itself?
I don't remember. You'd think she would have, but
I
I
think
can't
they did. I think
remember.
she does. Yes.
Hmm.
And I'm just trying to think of like, okay, once again, there's this weird like, I don't know, mysticism, religious something going on there. I don't know. Like I know what's going on in DS9, but I have no clue what's going on in Babylon 5.
Well, and
It's just
it's
weird.
that interesting trope. I think both shows do this to an extent where like alien religions are fulfilled to some extent by human characters, which is a sort of weird and interesting trope. It I mean, honestly, in some ways, it kind of reminds me of how, like, in fiction of the British Empire, you would have some British explorer, stumble upon some tribe or some society, and then get acclaimed as like gods or something, and it's a little bit of like a colonial fiction trope almost, but yeah, it's something that comes up in both DS9 and Babylon 5 of like alien religious prophecies and alien religions extending out to these like human figures.
Um, One of the things, just real quick comparison, we can finish up, was that uh, Catherine mentions how expensive stuff is on Babylon 5. Like, I think a loaf of bread or a thing of bread was like $5 or something like that, which is just further proof that like you'd much rather live in like the Star Trek universe where stuff's free.
Yeah, where the replicator's been invented.
Like, 'cause I have a feeling like in real life is going to end up like Babylon 5 at some point. We're just going to end up like, okay, you can go live on the space station, but it's going to be really expensive.
Well, the caveat there might be that like on DS9, you can get replicated copies of anything you want, or not anything, but a lot of things you might want and everything you would need. But I think there is the implication it throughout like Star Trek that like replicated stuff isn't as good as like, actual fruit, actual vegetables, actual meat, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I don't know I don't know in the Star Trek, kind of post scarcity socialist economy, like how you would ration like scarcity. But it does seem like you would have the issue too of like if you wanted to do like, an authentic sort of meal with like fresh ingredients, there might be a fair amount of expense to that in the Star Trek universe too, just of like getting something, shipped out so far. But you're definitely right that it's played up much more directly in Babylon 5, and like also the food options that people have on Babylon 5 just seems so much more limited.
All right. So what are we looking at next week?
We're looking at Mind War, which is a great episode of Babylon 5 and introduces a important part of the Babylon 5 mythos. And then we're looking at The Forsaken, which I think is a really fun DS9 episode, and brings in one of my favorite characters from The Next Generation.
All right. Looking forward to it.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for joining me, Matt. So this was Bob from Cascadia, had Matt from the Southland online, and we were covering DS9 v Babylon 5. We'll be back next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at B5VSDS9. For show notes, subscribe to our Substack, b5vsds9.substack.com. We're available on all major and most minor podcatchers. Please like and subscribe on your podcatcher of choice. If you have a question about either show or anything else you'd like us to tackle, leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or another podcatcher. Take a screenshot, email that screenshot to us with your question at b5vsds9@gmail.com, and we will answer your question on the show. We plan to start a Patreon with bonus content in the near future, so if you have any ideas of stuff you'd like to see for bonus episodes, email us at b5vsds9@gmail.com.